The biogeography of the planet is important to the work of physical geographers. The physical and spatial nature of the Earth's terrestrial biomes will be covered in this lecture. The study of the distribution of plants and animals in related ecosystems becomes important in our understanding of what global biogeography is. It's an important concern to, as I said before, not only the work of biologists but also physical geographers. A biome in this case is a large, stable terrestrial ecosystem that is characterized by specific types of plant and animal communities. As I also mentioned, we recognize in a sense 6 major terrestrial biomes. These include forest, savanna, grassland, shrubland, desert, and tundra. We will be taking a closer look at these various biomes in terms of their physical and biological nature. We will also attempt to understand them in relation to their physical location, local vegetation, soil orders, and of course climate. Additionally, we will take a look at patterns of precipitation, temperature patterns, and then what is happening to moisture in local soils. So the soil-water balance, or taking a systematic look at how water and nutrients move through local soils. Let's take a closer look at some of these definitions. The soil-water balance in this case is a measure of the moisture levels of local soils. There are mathematical concepts and components that we assign to this particular understanding. Researchers, in a sense, will measure the precipitation that is inputted into a local biome. We will adjust these measurements by also incorporating another concept, in this case evapotranspiration, or what is happening locally in terms of how the water or soil moisture evaporates from the surfaces of plants as they cool. So it, in a sense, is an estimated value that is established in relation to how plants are interacting with the soils that are part of their ecosystem and the levels of precipitation that are common to that location. It is an estimated value based upon typical local climatic conditions. Precipitation levels generally are measured through the use of rain gauges, and this is done annually. Respiration and plant evaporation rates are estimated according to the physiology of the plant and what is known of their exposed transpiring surfaces. This estimate is made under ideal or typical kinds of climatic conditions. Finally, the porosity of soils and the content of those pores, which are a measure ultimately of how we establish porosity, will be analyzed. Generally, when porosity measurements are established for local ecosystems, researchers will look at the A and B horizons, also known as the soils column, and they will measure again the porosity of these soil horizons. Soil moisture storage is really what's being estimated when this data rather is being collected. Soil moisture storage, in a sense, is the saving amount of water that receives recharge through deposition. It's the volume of water that is stored in soil and is maintained over annual cycles. As we attempt to better understand how water is behaving within an ecosystem, we have to take a much closer look at how water behaves within the body of a plant and how that plant is interacting with local soils. There is an expression of water known as hygroscopic water. This generally is useless to plants. It's an ultra-thin film of water that surrounds soil beds, or the clasts, or particles that I described in relation to how we study and categorize different kinds of soil types. Beyond this, we have capillary water, which is generally accessible to plants. It is held in place within the soil by its hydrogen bonds. The hydrogen molecules within the water bond to the particles or beds that categorize the soil horizons sampled. The remaining water in the study of an ecosystem and its soils is gravitational in nature. This is what remains. the water surpluses, in a sense, that temporarily exist within soil environments and fill the pores that the soils present. Gravitational water will be primarily responsible for the movement of minerals and nutrients through varying soil horizons. Now let's take a closer look at the terrestrial biomes, which are important to the work of global biogeographers. We'll take a look at all of the characteristics, including the moisture in soils, that are important to how these areas are studied, then classified, and organized. The first biome that we will take a look at is an equatorial forest biome. This is a terrestrial biome that possesses the following characteristics. We recognize plant communities, especially forest environments, to have a very thick leaf canopy. We find in this same forest environment broadleaf evergreen trees, and we find associated vines and ferns closer to the floor of these forest environments. Soils generally will be classified in terms of a typology as oxisols and udisols. We'll take a closer look at what those are. And then in terms of our Köppen climate system, generally we will find an equatorial forest environment in areas designated with a capital A, small f, or a tropical wet climate type, part of the tropical humid family of climates. Equatorial forest environments are generally considered to be warm, ranging in terms of annual temperature averages somewhere between 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the soil water ratio or balance in this case is going to be always expressed in some sort of year-round surplus. Taking a closer look at the soil types that are common to equatorial forest environments and generally tropical wet and tropical savanna climate types, we have things like oxisols. These are typically tropical soils that are characterized by intense moisture levels and soil horizons that are dominated by iron and aluminum oxides. This gives them a red or red-yellow coloration. We also, as I mentioned, have udisols, which are not as common in the equatorial forest environment, but are present. These are soils that are characterized by high expressions of iron, and they are dominated by clays. Ironically, as a result of looking at these two soil types, tropical forest soils are considered to be infertile. It is for this reason that major clear-cutting of the forest environments and the attempts that many governments have made to bring cash crops like corn and rice into these environments have failed. Take a moment to look over this map of the planet, specifically looking at locations where we have these tropical wet environments and the equatorial forests that are common to them. Feel free to pause the lecture as we take a closer look at how these various biomes are distributed across the planet. What you will find here, if you take a look at especially the dark green areas, we are dealing with generally equatorial environments, including tropical and subtropical regions. Next, we can take a closer look at a tropical savanna terrestrial biome. This generally will align itself spatially to the north or to the south of where we find our tropical, equatorial, or tropical wet environments. The tropical savanna environment is important for understanding how human beings have adapted and the origins of many of our cultural traditions. But it's also an area where we have some pretty unique adaptations in terms of plants and animals. The trees and shrubs that are common to this area have a very dry, thorny kind of physiology to them. They're also very well adapted for long periods of drought. We see in tandem with this a lot of clumped grasses and grassland environments. Again, when you think about savanna across the planet, these open grasslands are very, very common to them. Generally, these grasslands will have some sort of riverine watershed environment that is closely associated with them. The soils in these areas are dominated by alphasols, and they will overlap in a sense with the spatial distribution of climate types known as tropical savanna. So there is a similarity here between the name of our terrestrial biome and our climate type. The Köppen climate system, the declination is capital A, lowercase w. We see annual precipitation ranges of anywhere between 9 and 150 centimeters. And we also recognize a soil water budget of both surplus and deficit. Usually this will align itself in terms of this trend with annual cycles of weather, periods of drought, periods where we have these monsoon environments or monsoon seasons. The semi-arid tropical steppe regions and deserts that are very closely associated with these humid tropical savanna environments are very important in the study, in this case, of primates and other very complex mammals. These steppe environments, along with the tropical savanna biomes that surround them, as I mentioned previously, have alpha soils as a major soil type. Alpha soils are the most widespread of all earthly soils. They will have a gray to reddish brown color to them, and they will be known to be loose and unconsolidated with regard to the interaction of sand and clay particles. These parkland or park savanna-like environments are very common throughout what we recognize to be equatorial and subtropical Africa. We see locations such as Angola or Botswana being very good examples geographically of these environments. But really these environments, especially in the African continent, will stretch it really across the entirety of Central Africa, including both western and eastern portions of the continent. In South America, we find, in this case, savanna environments to the south and east of our more equatorial forest environments. We also find pocketed expressions of these throughout South Central Africa, South Africa, and portions of Australia and Southern Asia. Take a moment to look more closely at the geographic distribution of tropical savanna biomes. Next, we have a Mediterranean woodland and shrub biome, which is in a sense found in 6 widely distributed and relatively small areas in the mid-latitudes of the planet. As your authors point out, these are regions geographically which experience pronounced dry summers and very wet winter precipitation. Again, very similar to what we saw with our Mediterranean climate type. Short shrubs and grassy woodlands are very common, along with soil types recognized to be generally alpha soils and mollisols. In terms of our climate system, we recognize, according to Köppen, a mild mid-latitude kind of expression. Again, within the mild mid-latitude climate group, we recognize humid subtropical climates, marine western coastal climates, and then of course this Mediterranean climate type. Annual patterns of precipitation will include levels of between 25 and 65 centimeters. And again, this appears to be spread out over very hot, dry summers and cool winters. The summer soil moisture deficits are very, very common in these regions, and then they are balanced with winter surpluses. As you take a closer look at the geographic distribution of this particular Mediterranean biome, you will find that many of the Mediterranean environments are exceptional locations for agriculture and agricultural industries. In fact, the rise of the agricultural age, the Neolithic revolution in a sense, was very much a product of the soils and the climate and of course the weather patterns that are associated with this particular biome. As I said before, mollisols are very, very common. These are excellent agricultural soils. They have soft physical qualities regarding their overall texture. We see high concentrations of things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And again, they are also common to the Earth's steppe and prairie environments. So when you're taking a look at many of the earliest agricultural crops, many of the earliest crops that were domesticated, these are going to be plants that will thrive in environments where mollisols are common. And they're plants that, in terms of nutrients that they require for their annual cycle of growth will very much enjoy calcium-rich, potassium-rich, and magnesium-rich soil environments. Take a moment to look at this graphic a little more closely and compare it to what you have in your readings with regard to the different kinds of rock types, even soil types that are common to these particular regions. Focus again on where these Mediterranean biomes exist. As your authors point out, the mid-latitude grassland environments occur widely in places like North America and Eurasia. In the northern hemisphere, we find a very close geographical association between, in this case, the mid-latitude grassland biome and both the mid-latitude steppe expressions of the subtropical steppe region. What this does is this places this kind of biome with its plants and animals in not only the Central Valley of what is today Mexico, but also the Great Basin region and the American West. If we are to look at the Old World, we find that this kind of terrestrial biome is found just north of the tropical savanna region of what is today the African continent, and we find it just bordering the kind of south or southern border of the tundra region that we find in places like Russia and the Ukraine. Mid-latitude grassland biomes are also identified with regard to the Australian continent. We find them generally creating a ring around the more arid or desert-like central portion of the continent. These environments are typically expressing tall grass, prairie-like expressions, along with small sectionings of short grass environments, especially in higher elevations. We find that many of these environments are home to alpha sols and mollisols, so we do see global agriculture as being part of this phenomenon as well. In terms of the Köppen climate system, again, mid-latitude grassland environments associated with drier climates, in this case subtropical steppe and mid-latitude steppe. However, it should be mentioned that mid-latitude biomes are also associated with humid subtropical climate types. Annual precipitation patterns range from 25 to 75 centimeters, and in terms of the temperature conditions, we recognize mild winters and warm, sometimes hot summers. The soil moisture patterns that are associated with these mid-latitude grassland environments demonstrate a very efficient usage with annual periods of recharge. Take a look at this graphic again and begin to familiarize yourself where the mid-latitude grassland environments are distributed. A fifth biome that we're looking at in today's lecture is a warm desert to semi-desert, more arid kind of biome. Here we find bare ground and the presence of xerophytic plants, plants that are well adapted for extended periods of drought. As your authors have pointed out, there is a general decrease in precipitation as we move into arid and more desert-like environments. It's also a trend that as we move away from the equator in the low latitudes, both in the northern and southern hemispheres, we start to see this similar kind of pattern with regard to precipitation. The progression of this precipitation type is matched by a geographic increase in the amount of physical space that the warm desert and semi-desert-like biomes will begin to inhabit. In terms of the climate types that overlap with these biomes, we see subtropical deserts as being very commonly associated with the plants and animals associated, in this case with this biome, and then also the mid-latitude deserts as another kind of climate type. The soils in this region are aridosols. They are very much adapted toward a soil water balance that is out of balance, that we have annual deficits with regards to, in this case, soil moisture. Patterns, at least annual patterns of precipitation, are recognizing averages that are less generally than approximately 2 centimeters. So this chronic deficit is very, very common. However, when you move into average temperatures will be on a milder side. We'll see landscapes temperatures right around these temperatures will rise to meet or higher levels. Some additional definitions for you to consider with regard to at least the soils and their chemical nature. Iridosols, again, typically found in dry climatic regions. They will have a very low expression of organic matter in many of their soil horizons, really all of their soil horizons. And we will see that they are dominated by a few chemical processes, in this case calcification and salinization. Calcification connects to the concept of an annual deposit rate of calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate in local soils, and this is especially the case in the soil solemn of these iridosol environments. The salinization then relates to a process whereby soil water is being constantly drawn out of many of the surface soils, and it is also translocating up through lower soil horizons. What we see as a result of this is that there will be the precipitation of different kinds of salt and salt compounds as the water evaporates. Here we find another very important point with regard to adaptation. Again, the plants that call these very dry, hot regions home um, will be adapted to the increases in calcification rates and the high expression of calcium, magnesium, and salt in the soils. Correspondingly, they will be adapted to soil environments where there is little to no soil moisture. So we'll see very shallow root systems and very, in a sense, small scale root systems thriving in this area. Pause the lecture for a moment to compare again this diagram and its abbreviations and of course the color code system that is associated with these varying biomes, looking specifically at desert regions, and compare that to what you have in your readings. Last but not least, we have our tundra biome, a treeless environment with some small shrubbery in lower latitudes in terms of where it's distributed. We also see those small shrubs being mixed with surface mosses and short clumps of grasses. When we look at the distribution of tundra biome, we see that generally it will be associated with northern latitudes of severe mid-latitude climate types. This is as we move into a kind of a subarctic region, but then we also see it being expressed at lower latitudes associated with polar climates, specifically the tundra environments. Here, gelisols are common with regard to the soils that we see. And again, these are soil types that have, at least for a good portion of their annual cycle, some sort of frozen zone. Gelisols are relatively young soils with a very small scale profile that develops over time. And as I said, in at least shallower levels, levels closer to terrestrial layers, we find permanently frozen sections or sections of the soil horizons that remain frozen for long periods of time. You can associate the term permafrost with this phenomenon. As I said previously, in terms of our Köppen climate system, generally we will find these tundra environments localized to the tundra subtype of polar climate, but we do see their expression in northern portions of the severe mid-latitude climates, and then of course the southern border of the whole polar climatic region. This tells us that we have, in a sense, annual precipitation patterns which will vary by the season, and we will start to see some pretty extreme expressions in terms of seasonal patterns of temperature. Due to the nature of the soil types within this terrestrial biome, really the concept of a soil water balance and how we measure that is not applicable.